Hi, everybody. I'm Pastor Joshua Serrano.
And I am Pastor Jeremy Serrano. Welcome to the Serrano Brothers podcast.
This is episode number 5.
Oh, man. All right. So we've been doing this for 5 times. I had something interesting happen this last week.
Okay.
So on Saturday of this last week, I went to a fundraiser for a local church, St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Pleasant Hill. And they kind of did one of those forced seating things where everybody has to sit in a specific spot. You couldn't just sit wherever you wanted to because there's like limited capacity. And I got sat next to a woman who was a seismologist. And
Like earthquakes, like she measures like earthquakes, like ground shaking. That's what
yes, and in fact, she heads up this program for a local school, and they have an app out. And so just talking with her was really, really cool. And so I started asking her questions like, how do you measure, from the epicenter to the outside? How do you, I'm just asking all of these questions. And the more questions I asked her, the more she lit up.
Hmm.
And at one point, she's like, "Oh, I got to show this to you." And so she pulls out a piece of a journal, opens it up, and just starts drawing out how it all works. And she just has me mesmerized. And I am just captivated by all of the stuff that she's saying. And at one point, I kind of took myself out of it, and I commented to her, I was like, "You really love this stuff." And she looked at me and she goes, "Yeah, I guess I really do." I was like, "I can tell you are so engaging right now, that I am really enjoying listening to your very sciencey explanations of what's going on." And she was like, "Well, thank you very much for that." But it got me thinking about how I talk about stuff,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
how I've noticed how we kind of in the progressive main line, I feel like we're constantly tamping down our enthusiasm for our faith.
How so?
Um, I think we do that by not by almost being embarrassed about talking about God,
Okay.
and telling our God stories.
Okay.
And I know that I find that with myself. Like, we all have stories where we see God at work, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, I was having a conversation with somebody else, and as a part of that conversation, they're like, it was this, I don't know, kind of, I guess you could call it a God thing. And I was like, "Well, hold on a second, hold on a second. You think it's a God thing?" And they said, "Yeah, I do." And I said, "Then why didn't you just say that? Like,
Mhm.
why did you have this embarrassment around claiming it as a God thing?" Have you ever
Hmm.
noticed that in conversations?
I mean, I've seen that in conversations. I have seen people feel like they don't want to say, they might have a personal experience where they feel like it was a God thing or this moment that was a spiritual experience, but they are unsure. And I think especially because we're pastors, people might be a little more um, hesitant to claim something uh, like that. But I
Yeah,
think
see,
people do that in general too.
this was a clergy on clergy thing.
Oh, really interesting. Yeah.
And maybe because I came from the evangelical world just like you, but I feel like anytime somebody kind of dances around a God moment or feels embarrassed by it, my radar just goes off like, why are you doing that?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things I believe is that we should be as enthusiastic about talking about that like the seismologist was, of
Mm-hmm.
talking about their stuff. And just owning who we are and claiming who we are. And I think that that goes to a little bit of discernment. Like, how do we discern when something is actually a God moment?
Mm. I feel like I'm never. It's oh, I feel like always in retrospect. I feel like I can go, oh, God was moving in that situation in a way that I can tangibly see. I'm very hesitant to say if it's happening in the moment. Usually, it'll take me a little while to look back on something and say, oh, okay, the Spirit was moving in this situation that I had not seen. I get very hesitant to say, oh, God's moving right now in this way. And I think for fear of sounding manipulative, and also because I could be wrong. It takes a little bit of time for me to be able to discern whether the Spirit was actually moving, right? And so I tend to do this kind of in retrospect, and uh,
I think that's a good principle, though, Josh, that we can discern God, and it is very difficult to do in the present moment. I think it's almost impossible to do for future moments, right? Like I don't think we can guess what God is going to do, right? And I don't think we should. But I think we can look back on our own histories and our own experiences and claim them as God moments.
yeah, for sure.
And I don't think we have to, and I think we can talk about that with a certain level of confidence after discernment.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you about one moment. And it's one of those moments where God worked, but it seemed like an accident to us. When I was at Fuller Theological Seminary, I was doing my clinical pastoral education, and the plan was for me to to go on and get my Lutheran retreading at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. It's a 9-month program. I was going to go up to the Bay Area and be there by myself, just get the schooling done. My wife was going to apply for a teaching job in the area where she was to continue living where she was with the kids. And as she's applying for all these different teacher jobs, she applies for a job in Alameda. And she thought she was applying for a job to Alhambra, which is close to where we were. And so she calls them and says, I'm so sorry I applied for this job. I'm not going to do it. It's too far away. I'm down in Southern California. You all are in Northern California. And they're like, well, just interview for it. Just interview for it. And she was like, okay. So they get on Zoom. My wife is really good at what she does. She's an excellent interviewer. And they immediately offer her the job. And so the plan and trajectory we had for the next 9 months came into question. And so we discerned, well, maybe we should all go as a family up there. And so one weekend, Jess and I drove to the Bay Area. We stayed with our friend Tuhina Rash and Carl Rash, and stayed in their apartment. They were so lovely to have us, and we found an apartment that weekend. And so we're like, oh man, we're gonna actually do this. Like we happen to have some money where we could move, and my wife got a job working for Alameda. She's been working there for almost 10 years now. I'm up here with her, and God has continued to, as a part of that, my wife got cancer for the first time. And if we would have been separated, I can guarantee I would have quit school. I would have gone back down to do that. But since she had really good health care, since she was the main breadwinner at the time, I can see, looking back on it, God at work, working through that in order to set us up to be cared for when something bad happened. Yeah. I can't help but see God in that. Now, what I'm not saying is that God gave my wife cancer and all of the other kind of terrible theologies that go along with that. But what I'm saying is that I saw God work at keeping us together for when tragedy came. That's nothing but a God moment for me, in that it boiled down to my wife accidentally applying to a job in Alameda.
Yeah, that's a great story, man. I mean, and I think you can rightly claim that as a God moment, as something that God was, leading you through, like Psalm 23, both by the still waters and the valley of the shadow of death. God doesn't promise to take away the death or the valley of the shadow of death, but lead us through it.
Right. Well, we'll have to talk about all of that kind of bad stuff, later. In another podcast, we'll talk about all that stuff later. Do you have any kind of, like, when we talk about like moments of God's work, do you have any that just like automatically click in your head?
Well, I can't help but think about when I met Anne. I remember I was having a really bad day, and
who is Anne?
Anne's my wife now. Uh, and this is how we met. I was having a really bad day, and I called you. I was like, "Man, I need to get out. Let's go do something." And you said, "Hey, well, I'm going to go to an ordination of a person I know. Why don't you come with me?" And okay, well, cool. Ordinations are fun. So we go, and all our friends are there, and I just so happened to meet Anne, and we kind of struck up a great conversation, and where I was at in life, I was like, I don't know about this. But if she, we didn't exchange phone numbers, we didn't, say that we would talk later. We just said, hey, good conversation. On the way home, you and I were talking, and you said, hey, I noticed you were kind of connected with that woman. I said, yeah, that was great, that was good, but I didn't ask for her number or anything like that. I said, if she reaches out to me, maybe we'll see what comes of it. And then when I got home, there was a message on Facebook waiting for me with a friend request from her, and basically the rest is history. We've been married for 3 years now. But yeah, I can't help but look at that moment and go, wow, that was God moving, and I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we can rightly say that God has moved in a situation when there is more light, more life, more connection with people,
Yeah.
more justice, any of those kinds of things. I think we can say, look back on our history and go, okay, that was God working, and claim it proudly and with enthusiasm. um but I think sometimes we don't do that, um because of how it's been misused.
Mm.
Because there are people who will make claims like God spoke to them. Like, I think God speaks to me,
Mm.
right? I think God speaks to other people. And I feel like I can rightly say that God speaks to me when God leads me towards repentance.
Mm.
To I had a situation where I kind of spoke brashly to a parishioner,
Mm.
and I didn't say anything. um it was an older parishioner. I just spoke in a way that was a little too familiar, and like I would with friends, and they were offended by it. And it took me about a month before I really heard God tell me, like, you should apologize for that.
Mm.
You should try to reconnect here,
Mm.
because they were offended by that, and um you could have comported yourself better.
Mm.
And so I think God does speak to me, and I discern that when God tells me to reconnect to love. Are there any other things that you can think of that you know when it's God speaking to you?
Well, I just I'm so grateful that the Spirit moves among all of us, and when I miss something, somebody else catches something, you know. So just yesterday we had a memorial service, and a member of the congregation came up and wanted to tell me something that was going on with them. But through that conversation, um, I'm also trying to. Um, Somebody else came up and kind of started talking to me as well, and I redirected my focus. Um, and another parishioner who was overhearing this conversation said, "Hey, I just want to let you know that I don't think that person was done telling you what they wanted to say. And I know you were, interrupted, but uh, I think you might have missed something."
Hmm.
And so I went to the parishioner who I was talking before, and we talked a little bit more, and it was a great conversation. And later on in the evening, I emailed that parishioner who had told me, and I said, "Just I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for paying attention and seeing when I missed something." And that allowed me to have a good conversation with the other member of the other member. And so for me, that is also a God moment. Like that is a moment in which the Spirit moved, and people saw we were taking care of each other. And I'm not immune to, when a lot of things are going on at once, to redirecting my focus and missing something somebody might be telling me. And so that another parishioner caught it, I was so grateful for.
Right. The Holy Spirit is in the, not only in us individually, but in the community, and is using the community to help you minister.
Yeah, and you have to care for each other. That's really what it comes down to, right? um yeah.
Hmm.
Well, I think this was a good conversation about this, and I think for the people who might be listening, I wonder, you know, are some moments for you? Can you look back on your life and go, "Yeah, God was moving in this situation"? And if you can name a story, if you can name a situation, I think Jeremy and I would just like to encourage you to own the story, and don't be timid in being able to share that experience with others.
Yeah.
It's very important that we own our faiths and our stories, and trust that God is moving among us and guiding us.
And in that, so we each have our own, you know, we each have our own God stories. But I think that we also have a long trajectory, a long meta narrative of God's stories in our life. So we have parts of the Christian world will talk about testimony,
Hmm.
right? So I just wrote a newsletter article about this, where we have like I just gave a testimony, you just gave a testimony to God's work in your life in a specific instance. But I think I have my testimony as well. And I think the difference is that my testimony starts when I was born, and it tracks God's work in my life up until now. So my testimony is something like, I grew up in a Roman Catholic family, to parents who made me go to church very regularly. And one of the most significant events that happened in my life was early on, was when my parents got divorced. They really stopped going to church after that. And I became really angry.
Hmm.
And I was angry for a really long time, until a group of friends who were Christians kind of took me underneath their wing and really kind of loved me despite the anger that I was holding on to. And I had a conversion experience, which now as a Lutheran, I recognize was kind of the final experience of all these little experiences that started in my baptism. So I had this kind of final conversion experience, this big conversion experience, I should say, in which I recognized God's work and my life was changed. And um and it allowed me to God began to take away my anger and my pain and my insecurities that had built up over time, um, and has led me into a new life.
Hmm.
You know, so that's like my testimony as a whole. That's my big testimony, um, which is much different than like my wife's testimony,
Yeah.
who was born into the church, got baptized into the church, and has been faithful her whole life. You know,
For
and
sure.
so that's her testimony, is that this she her conversion um um was really early on in her life, and it was just one of many decisions. You know, for me it was like this transformative point.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
for hers, her baptism took the first time. You know,
That's good. It's a
do
good
you
story,
ever
man.
have people give testimonies?
We did in our congregation this summer, and we did it around spaces in the church that were meaningful. It's basically a testimony. So we took different parts of the congregation and said, what is meaningful to you about the baptismal font? What is meaningful about the altar, the pulpit, the narthex, the hall? Um, and in order to try to elicit testimonies. Um,
Was
and
there any stories that kind of touched you?
well, I was on sabbatical,
Oh,
but I was setting it up for the congregation to do. Another pastor is the one who really drove it home, but that's that's one of the things we did.
we have that coming up in Advent. I'm having people give a testimony around um, around Jesus coming into their life, like the Christmas story.
Nice.
And so I'm pretty excited to kind of see this. I think there's real power in having us tell these stories to each other.
I agree. I agree.
All right. Anything else you want to talk about today?
I think it's been a great conversation.
All right. So I want to encourage people to think about their God stories, think about testimonies they may have, and maybe even what their own testimony is. And if you see me around, don't ever be afraid to tell me it, because I want to hear it. It encourages my faith when I hear.
Me too. I agree
stories.
with you.
All right, friends, we're logging off. Peace.